Hi, welcome to Tales of Dread. Tonight, we have some Bigfoot stories for you. Enjoy and don't forget to like and subscribe. I never know how to describe this, especially since I'm the last person who would believe it's happening. But now, after living with it for years, I finally understand what's going on. So, I have lived alone in a very lonely place far from anyone else north of Seattle. It's near some islands, but I won't say too much about them. Just know that it's pretty lonely and that I live in a cabin by myself. It takes more than 3 hours to drive to the closest town. Cell phone service is almost non-existent out here. It's not very good. It's so far away that only a few maps show it. Anyway, I'm out here to get away from the noise and chaos of the city and find peace and quiet. I live alone, so I guess you could call me a hermit. Still, it would be nice if that were true. In reality, though, it's more like a cold, dark paradise where I'm more likely to be scared than to feel calm. That's how I feel after going through this. Since the start of the pandemic, I've been living out here for about 1.5 years. It's been a rough ride. I'm not going to lie. At first, it's nice to be out here by myself, but sometimes it's pretty scary. I don't have any kids. I'm not married to anyone. A lot of my family lives in states other than where I do. So, I've been able to live on my own. I've never been the kind of person who's afraid of much, and I think that's because I grew up in a small southern town. This is where I learned not to talk to strangers and that monsters under the bed were just stories to keep kids from getting lost. I remember that my mom read things to me, I guess to get me ready for things like this. So, the first time I knew something was really wrong was soon after I moved here, when I woke up to this pounding on my house in the middle of the night. Then I heard the sound of something sharp scraping against the side of my cabin. When I opened the door to look outside, there was nothing there, so I was sure I was just dreaming. I went home and went to sleep. After that, I didn't hear anything for a long time. Now, I remember that at some point I heard this heavy breathing that made me feel very uneasy. I just brushed it all off because I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Later, when I went to cut firewood for myself, I always had the feeling that someone was watching me. I knew no one else was around, and a quick look around showed me that. I figured that my mind was just messing with me. So I went about my day. Once, I had to take my dog with me to the store. He was the only thing that kept me from being lonely when I was all by myself out there. Shortly after I moved here, someone shot and killed my dog, who was the only pet I had ever loved and cared for deeply. But that's something else. When I brought my dog Oscar with me, things began to become clear. It was a cold night, and I had gotten lost on my way home. I didn't have a phone or a compass, so I couldn't figure out where I was going. At least that went over well. As I already said, it was very spotty. Some places were completely empty, while others gave you hope of a bar or two. I didn't know the area very well at the time. So I was still trying to figure out what to do after I got off. When I turned around to see what was going on, I saw a big mane shadow moving quickly toward my truck from the tree line. I yelled something that probably shouldn't be repeated, and my dog was barking like crazy. I throw the truck and drive quickly out of that pull-off. I didn't know where this thing was going, but it made me feel very bad. When I got home, I realized how much that had scared me. After a while, things settled down, and I started to think that ghosts and monsters don't exist and that it was all in my head. Maybe I was going crazy for real. Everything seemed fine at first, but a little while later, I heard some very strange sounds coming from outside my window. No, Keep in mind that I live in a cabin, which is kind of in this small, I guess you could call it a mountain, but it's not really a mountain. Nearby is a thick forest, and at night it's pretty hard to see anything. I'm thinking to myself, what animal could be making these strange noises? It sounds like something is being scratched by a big animal. So my first thought is bear. At the time this happened, it was completely dark outside, and there were no street lights or other lights in sight. So I looked out my window to see if I could see anything that might have made the noise. And when I turned around, I saw two big, glowing eyes looking back at me. These were yellow, and they kind of glowed on their own, like a deer's eyes do when headlights shine right on them. I switched to action mode, put on my boots, grabbed my rifle, and storm outside to shoot this thing in the head. When I go outside, I hear a very loud growl coming from the dark. It sounds like a scared lion that is half green. I'm not having it. I raised my gun and fired 3 shots into the dark toward the creature. I hear this horrible, unimaginable scream, and then I see something run away, and crash into some trees while screaming. It was very scary. I ran back to my cabin because I thought it would be best to stay there in case more people came back. I could hear this thing scream for a few minutes afterward, and as time went on, it got further and further away. It stopped at some point. I was really scared. I told my uncle what was going on by calling him. He talked to me on the phone for almost an hour and asked me in great detail what had happened. I'm trying to figure out if I'm making this up or if there's something else going on. No matter how she tried to explain it, I knew she was wrong. There are some places where I can get a good signal. But after that phone call, I knew something really bad was going to happen tonight. Now, this cabin is also on a road that goes nowhere. If you don't want to take the main dirt road, the only way in or out of this place is through the hiking trails at the end of the road. So I used my headlamp to set up some traps for whatever might be calling. I set up bear traps and other fun things for them all outside. The feeling that something bad was going to happen lasted for a while, but nothing bad ever did. Night went by. This was without a doubt one of the scariest nights of my life. I was so tired from not sleeping the night before, but my adrenaline kept me awake. After that night, I decided to just assume that everything out here in the woods is trying to kill me and treat it that way. About a year has passed since something like this happened. I'm better off now than I was back then. I don't believe in Bigfoot or anything else like that. But after everything I've been through out here, I wouldn't be surprised if it was true. After everything I've heard and seen while living alone in the woods, I'm starting to think there's a monster in there. I lost faith in almost everything. After what happened, I'm going to try to have a better attitude again. Maybe one day someone will find this story and be able to figure out for themselves what I saw in the woods. There's one thing I know for sure, and there's nothing you can say to prove me wrong. Outside the cabin that night, I'm sure I'll see an animal I've never seen before. Around 2011 or 2012, a few of my hiking buddies and I saw something that we can only describe as a Bigfoot. I will say that we never thought there was a Bigfoot before this. We have never been interested in the paranormal or anything supernatural, and we aren't now. People who believe in ghosts and Bigfoot used to make fun of us. This really opened our eyes and showed us that there's more to the world than meets the eye. Her story is told here. We were hiking in the woods in southern Ohio with 3 other people. At this point, we've been hiking for 3 hours and have decided to stop for lunch. After getting off to a good start in the morning, we set down our food and started hiking again right away. It was somewhere around 1 p.m. in the afternoon. One of us saw something in the distance that looked like an animal. It had very long arms and walked, sort of like a monkey. It sort of looked like it was walking on all fours, but it wasn't. It was just leaning over. At first, we thought it might have been a man messing around. We weren't sure, it looked weird, but based on the size of this animal, we could tell from a distance that it wasn't a bear. And then, I think we all came to the same conclusion in a matter of seconds. This wasn't a joke played by a man or someone else. This wasn't Bigfoot, but at the time it didn't seem like it was Bigfoot. Then this thing noticed us almost immediately, though it was more like 5 seconds. As soon as we stopped staring at it, it stopped and started throwing what I would call a temper tantrum. It then ran toward us, beating its chest violently and swinging its arms wildly while making this sound I can't even describe. It was impossible. Our instincts took over, and we all started running away from this animal without even thinking. One of our friends ran in a different direction. I ran after my other friend, who was sprinting in the opposite direction. We were both going to the same place, though. We didn't stop running for about 20 minutes. We ran until we got to a small clearing, where we all fell down very quietly and calmly. Nothing can be heard. I remember that it was so quiet that even the woods around us were silent, but birds were singing right after lunch. The forest was full of sounds and noises. This was eerie. It's like we were in some movie, like Silent Hill. We started telling each other right away what we had just seen and heard. Then it hit us. It wasn't just any animal. It was there. This had nothing to do with that. To describe what we saw today as well as possible. It looked bad. In the face, it looked like maybe a baboon and a man had a baby. Its face was long like a baboon's, but it didn't have the blue and red coloring. It had deep-set eyes like a baboon, but they were much brighter and yellow. Its face looked angry, and its mouth was full of sharper teeth. Again, not like monkey teeth. The face looked a bit more human than a monkey's, but it was still very similar. I guess the head was more round than a baboon's, which was kind of cone-shaped and pointed. The body is big, like a football player or a bodybuilder. It has thick hair, like a bear. In reality, it looked like a very large man with very large arms. If I had to guess, I would say they are between 9 and 10 feet tall. I mean, it's impossible to say enough about how big this thing was. It was very big. Now, please tell me what I saw that day. I can still remember it like it happened yesterday. When I saw a Bigfoot for the first time. I had just finished high school and was a young man, so I decided to spend the summer exploring some of the backcountry. I was taking in all that nature had to offer me one afternoon when I found myself walking through a dense area of plants, a forest, that ran next to a river. There, my eyes fell on a creature that was unlike anything I had ever seen. In fact, when I saw this thing for the first time, it was something I had never seen before in my life. I wanted to run, but I was also shocked by what I was seeing. What I was seeing was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. I hadn't seen me yet, so I knelt on the other side of the river and drank water the same way a person would, by cupping my hand around it and taking small sips. My first thought was that it was a big native person drinking water. When it looked up at me, though, I realized it wasn't a person, even though its face and black eyes made me think of a Neanderthal. It stood up right away, turned around, and walked away. It looked like it was laughing at me or annoyed by me, or at least that's how I interpreted it. I was shocked by this, and I went home right away. I couldn't tell anyone what I saw, of course. No one would take me seriously. Later, I met people who were really into Bigfoot, and I was able to tell them about my real encounter. The thing that's interesting is that Bigfoot is usually said to be pretty big. It was probably about the same height as this. About 6 feet tall, I was. I think it wasn't old enough yet. I know it's hard to believe all of this, especially since I don't have any pictures or proof, but that's what happened when I got close to this thing in the river in the forest near my house. Only people who have seen these things in person can tell how they walk and act. So it's likely they could understand. Sometimes, you'll know for sure if they're there or not. They are good at hiding. But this one didn't mind being out in the open for whatever reason. I wondered if maybe I had just scared it and that was why it was mad. Anyway, just take me at my word. Bigfoot really exist. In late 1976 or early 1977, when I was almost 15 years old, my friend Kurt and I were riding our bikes 6 miles east of Cascade, Arkansas, from a fishing trip on the White River. It seemed like it took a lot longer than that bad trip. Kurt and I were stopped at a creek crossing when we saw something moving in the woods that looked like a tall man. It was quite dark, brownish, or very black, with big muscles and long arms and legs, according to Harry. When it saw us, it looked up and decided to throw some rocks and mud at us. Even though Kurt said it growled, I didn't hear anything. I just saw it reach down, grab some mud and rocks, and throw them in our direction. It then hit the tree trunk with something big, like a piece of wood. We got on our bikes and rode hard to get home. We told everyone what had happened as soon as we got there. No one really thought what we said. After that happened, though, either my mother's sister or my aunt called to tell her that she had seen one of them in the woods near the house. She wouldn't or couldn't tell my mom what it was, so she laughed it off and said it was just a child's imagination or that she mistook a bear for something else. But now I'm not sure if Kurt and I saw a woman picking mites out from under her arms or if we just happened to meet her after she had been out of the water for years. I never thought about why we saw that in me, but one day in 2001, I watched a show on Animal Planet called Bigfoot. They showed the actors drawings of what this creature might look like and how it might act, which made the CGI process easier. When I first saw it, it was running away from us and into the woods right across from where we were standing with our bikes. So, based on the direction it was going and where we were, I could get a pretty good idea of how tall it was. This thing had to be big, but it couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 feet tall. Based on what I think, if we had been 30 to 40 yards closer, we would have been too close to this thing to feel safe. We could see that it had a lot of hair, just like Bigfoot. I can tell you for sure that it doesn't look like any man or woman on Earth. This creature is much stronger and acts in a different way than any wild animal. We would have seen something that looked a lot like a Neanderthal with long arms and legs. My meeting with Bigfoot was a little bit different from most. I didn't think this thing was so mean when I saw it. This is how I want to tell my Bigfoot story. I might be able to help people learn what they look like. So more people will believe that these things really exist and are out there somewhere, since many people still think we're crazy for really believing they do. If nothing else, Maybe someone could figure out why some of us have seen them, but know that not everyone who says they've seen them is lying. In early fall of 1989, my friends and I were camping by a river near some hot springs in Northern California. I was going into the 8th grade at age 13, so I was still a kid at heart. Now, I was a pretty bad kid because my friends and I had smuggled in alcohol and cigarettes, which we smoked a lot of. Since our families were all back home miles away from where we were camping, we didn't have to worry about getting caught. We started to hear what sounded like heavy footsteps walking through the trees behind us and around the river. Since it was late at night, we figured it was just some drunk hillbillies or something. We were scared, but we thought that being together would keep us safe. We tried to talk to it after hearing it walk behind us for a while. We yelled at them and talked bad about them because we thought it was funny. When we were drunk, we had a lot of fun, but when the sound stopped, we found out that no one was there, even though it sounded like footsteps getting closer and closer. Even branches and stuff were being broken. Then we start to feel less and less safe. We had flashlights with us, but by the time we got close to camp, everyone had already run into their tents and made sure they were secure. No one used them much. I can remember that night like it was yesterday. I was in the bottom of my sleeping bag, my tent was open, and I could still hear the sounds. Then I see a big thing looking at me from above. I don't remember if it was standing or sitting, but I remember a hairy, ugly face that almost looked like it had been shaved. It didn't look right. It had big eyes. I could see them very clearly in the far distance from the slow glow of what was left of the burning embers. The way the light reflected off of them as they looked at me made them look like big black marbles. I shined my flashlight up the face of this thing. It looked like a living nightmare, and I could feel it looking at me. This scared me for some reason. Suddenly, this thing started to make a noise that sounded like it was starting to move. Maybe it didn't know I was looking back at it, so I hid in my sleeping bag, scared to death. I was going to die from this. I couldn't breathe, and tears were running down my face. My friends in the distance were scared, but they didn't know what was going on. I still think they were making jokes. I was trying not to make a sound because it felt like this thing was in the tent with me. After what seemed like an eternity, I heard it walk away from my tent and into the woods. I started yelling at everyone to get up and pack their stuff. We had to leave right away, even if they didn't want to. No one moved, and they fought against it, even though many of them were still drunk and we were all 13 or 14. We didn't want our parents to talk to us like that. But I didn't care. I sat alone in my tent and cried for about 15 minutes before packing everything up myself and walking back home through the trail that led out of the forest, even though it was about 1 in the morning. I didn't care. Even after all these years, I haven't camped there since. And those close friends, We didn't hang out much after this, though. I'm not sure why I haven't been back. I just know this thing, whatever it is out there. I can't seem to forget what happened to me when I was young in those woods. Even if I try really hard. I doubt you're going to believe me. So I guess I should just stop writing this. Still, I'm glad you let me tell you my story. I've only told a few family members and close friends before, but this is the first time I've really told anyone else. Oh, and one more thing, you might think I'm crazy for walking out there alone at night. But you don't understand? I was terrified. I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from this big creature, whatever it was at the time. I thought it was some kind of monster or something. I did not quite understand. My uncle and I went on a hunt. He likes to tell me that it's hunting. It's just sitting and drinking beer until you get bored. We left at 8 AM, drove 20 miles to the river, and didn't find anything. Afterwards, we sat in the truck for 4 hours while he drank beers and looked through binoculars. He would occasionally look up and then look back down at his drink or the bottle of poison he was trying to hide from his wife. Then we heard something. I've never been one to believe in Bigfoot, but after hearing the strange sound, meeting some very strange people, and finally seeing what I saw, let's just say I'm not so sure what I think it was coming from behind the trees behind us. There was a big fence made of barbed wire. There were no animal paths down there either. When I looked at my uncle, he said, "It looks like someone is hunting here." He got out of his truck and walked back to it. Now, keep in mind that I was born and raised in the city for the most part. So, the next part is very hard for me to say, but I'll tell you what happened and you can decide for yourself if you believe me or not. We ran through the grass, climbed over the barbed wire fence, and did the heavy brush on the other side, where we both heard the noise. Now, I should also say that as soon as we got out of the truck, we saw that there was no one there. So, because my uncle thought it was a big buck, we went after it. But when we got there was nothing there. We didn't hear the buck run away, and there were no animal tracks or anything else to show that an animal had been there. We looked around for a few minutes before giving up and walking back to the truck. My uncle and I were still thinking about it when we heard a horrible scream and a loud crash that sounded like something was barreling through the woods close to us. While looking for the missing buck, my uncle dropped his binoculars and pulled out his tiny pistol. He forgot to take his gun with him. Both of us ran as fast as we could without stopping. This thing sounded like a moose wearing bowling balls on its feet and body running through the trees. We ran as fast as we could toward the truck. Behind us, we saw a hairy man about the size of a small giant swinging wildly and crashing into some trees while screaming and moaning. Anyway, my uncle stops, takes a shot, and the animal stopped in its tracks and ran into the brush. I couldn't see his face, but from what I could see, this was a terrible thing. I'm pretty sure I saw flat nose and deep sunken-in eyes. Its whole body was black. I thought he looked like he was half man and half gorilla. But after that, I can't remember anything else, except that I woke up in the back of the truck and my uncle was shaking me. He told me that was after he shot it. This thing went away, and then he grabbed me and put me in the back of the truck. I must have passed out from fear. I hadn't been awake for maybe 3 or 4 minutes. But then he took out a silver flask and gave it to me so he could see what it did. He said that if I didn't drink his magic potion, he wouldn't have to tell the story for a while. He felt very strongly about this. So don't ask me too many questions about what happened after he shot at him. All I know is that none of it makes sense until that point. But after I swung his magic flask a couple of times, we got back in the truck and left. My uncle, who died in 2020, never wanted to talk about it again. I think it scared him a lot, but at the end of March 2020, he died of COVID pneumonia. I still miss him a lot. I thought that going hunting with my friends would be like going anywhere else. We were ready with our rifles and our packs. We were going out into the wilderness of Michigan to get some practice in before deer season started. I now know that what we did might not have been legal. But on the other hand, a lot of people do things that are against the law. The Grand River National Forest seemed like a good place to start. It was home to many different kinds of animals, like bears, wolves, and even a mountain lion every once in a while. Even so, it is one of the most remote counties, and only a few other things have been seen there. Jackson County is the place to take your problems if you don't want to see anyone for miles, and I thought they couldn't have picked a better place for this event. We had been hiking for hours, looking for signs of animals. Even though it was late summer, we didn't see much, which was surprising. Now, we were so angry and upset. We had been out here for hours and couldn't find a single rabbit. We had even been following a small animal trail, but as soon as we turned a bend in the trail, everything around us seemed to change. Things got very quiet, and we could all feel the hairs on the back of our necks stand up. Some of us said a few words about it, but most of us just kept going. Then we all stopped in our tracks and looked straight ahead as this big shadow on the side of the path started to move. Then we all looked under this big bush and saw 2 big brown eyes staring back at us. We thought it might be a deer or an elk. We knew that even though deer season hadn't started yet, that didn't mean much because there would be more legal hunters out there. But it didn't make sense this far out. This thing stood up, and we saw that it wasn't a deer or an elk. It was clear that it was hunched over. We were surprised by how high it was. We could see everything. It looked like a big, hairy man. You need to know something now? As far as I can remember, none of us ever even thought about Bigfoot or Sasquatch. No one ever thought about this. It looked a little scared and ran as fast as it could away from us, disappearing into the bushes. Within seconds, we were all shocked, and we ran after it for a while to get a better look at what it was. When it turned around, this scream came out because we knew we were right behind it. We all had a desire to kill it because we thought that if it was a Bigfoot, we could kill it and prove it. But we never did catch up with him, and what happened next makes me regret that I even tried to find him and chase after him. After a while, we decided to turn around and head back north to our last spawning site, hoping to find this thing as we went. As we walk down the path, we keep looking for this thing. My friend Greg saw this big patch of dried red blood on the ground. Greg also shot this thing while it was running away, which is why it was screaming. Sorry if I forgot to mention that. We could still hear the gunshot, and the thought came to her mind. We kept going north in order to find this thing. We thought that this thing was bleeding because it had been shot. We're now easier to find. He'd have to move more slowly. At this point, we were pretty excited because we thought we were about to catch our first North American ape or something. But as we turned another corner in the past, we heard something move behind us. We all turned quickly, and this thing's eyes were again bleeding. This thing looked angry, and he wasn't trying to get away from us this time. Instead, he ran straight toward us, and as he did, we all, and I especially, had the feeling that we were going to die. This thing hit me with almost all of its strength, knocking me back before I could do anything about it. It threw me 15 feet off the trail and into a small ditch where trees and bushes grew. It literally picked me up off the ground and spun me around like a doll. I was hurt pretty badly. Then he grabs my other friend, wraps his hand around him, and throws him hard against a tree. Next, he ran at Greg, who shot him in the chest several times with his gun. Greg started screaming in pain when he was slammed into the tree, breaking it right down to its base. The creature that hit him hard was standing right next to where the tree had broken. This thing was just messing with us, because it barely hit us and sent us all flying. I'm not sure if this was on purpose or not, but it seemed like it was keeping its killing power in check. When I heard similar screams in the distance, I think this creature was actually moving in for the kill. Now that I think about it, I think it was another one of these creatures calling to it, because this thing answered with a loud scream that hurt our ears and then took off in that direction. We were all pretty badly hurt, and had broken bones and were bleeding. I can't believe none of us died. We managed to pull ourselves out of the ditch we landed in, and it took us hours to get back to the truck because we were so badly hurt. I was sure that this thing would come after us and kill us. It broke a few of my bones, cracked a rib, and threw me 15 feet into a tree. We were all seriously hurt, and had to stay in the hospital for several days. Luckily, we all got better. I'm not even getting into how bad what happened was, but I don't have time to go into all the details. Long story short, this thing messed up me and my friends, and if its friend hadn't called it, we would have been in trouble. If this thing had seen us, it would have killed us. I remember it was a colder night in October, and the leaves were just starting to change color. The air smelled like crisp, musty autumn. When I heard it, I was alone at my kitchen table with just a cup of coffee for company. The sound was a low roar or growl that came from the woods behind my house. It sounded like an animal, maybe a big dog, but there was something off about it. Even though my room was warm, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up and goosebumps popped up all over my body. I heard another roar at the same time as this one, but it was louder and closer, so I jumped out of my chair and ran into our backyard to see what was going on. Nothing was visible. You might think I'm crazy for running outside to see what this was, since it was just trees. But at the time, I was more interested than scared. The noise again got louder just on the other side of the fence. Then I heard something crashing through the bushes. Initially, it could have been a bear, though. I didn't want to go after our chickens. I grabbed a flashlight from the patio table and ran to the chicken coop to see how they were doing. When I got there, I saw that they were all safe and sound in their little den. Then I went into the garage and took my husband's shotgun out of there. Whatever it was, it sounded like it was very close, and I'm not going to let it get my chickens. I didn't have to look for long before I saw something black and hairy move in the trees. At first, it looked like a bear. After I took aim and shined my flashlight directly on it, it walked away. I fired a shot in its direction, hoping the noise would scare it away, but it didn't. Then there was a second, louder roar from directly behind me. Before I could even figure out what was going on, something else came out of the darkness and lunged at me with its mouth wide open. It hit me just inches away when it ran into the end of my shotgun barrel, which was aimed straight at it. As soon as we looked at each other, I fired. It screamed and ran into the woods. I saw it run away while it was badly hurt and bleeding a lot. I'd killed a Bigfoot. Then another idea popped into my head. More of them are there. Should I go look for him in the woods, hunt him down, and kill him? Wait until morning after agonizing over it for what seemed like forever? I decided to go back inside and round up my husband. We could finish the job before going back outside, but when I told the police that I had just shot a bear in our backyard, they said, "What? People shooting bears so late at night isn't something they hear about very often," so they were very skeptical and could tell I was talking about something else, but they agreed to send someone. When I went back inside, it was quiet outside. Someone was at the scene with a flashlight, looking around to see if they could find anything. They told me to come over to where they were standing. They found something with blood on it. I told them that a big, mean bear had tried to break into the property and get into the chicken coop. The officer just looked at me blankly, and then my husband, the officer, and I heard a loud scream from behind the woods, about 100 yards from where the second animal I shot with the shotgun ran away. The officer's face turned white so quickly, and he said, "Mom, give me a minute," and then he walked away and started radioing something I couldn't hear, but he looked scared and worried. He walked back to me and said, "Mom, I'm going to have my supervisor come here and take over for me. Good luck." And just like that, he got in his patrol car and drove away. My husband and I didn't know what to do because the only way we could handle this was with an officer, but he was gone. We went back into the house, but the shotgun was still ready. During the night, her house was hit and she heard screams and shouts. We didn't think it was safe to try to shoot at these things outside anymore. But when we woke up the next morning, all 18 of our chickens were dead. They had been torn into pieces, not shredded, but it looked like someone had grabbed them, pulled off all their heads, and then torn them apart. It was a bloody mess, and part of their cage or chicken coop was ripped open, as if something big came through and tore it. We didn't pay any attention to the whole Bigfoot thing, but we moved soon after that without any trouble. One of the scariest things I've ever been through, but my husband and I no longer have to deal with anything like this. But do you think this might have been a Sasquatch? I was camping in a part of the Rockies that wasn't near anyone else. I was by myself. Being a loner makes you do stupid things like Bill, who was out in the middle of nowhere with no one to help him. But I think that way. The weather had been nice for days, but on my last night of camping, a very bad storm came through the area. I chose a spot that was out in the open, but the tree next to which I set up my tent was the one that fell on it and me. On the inside, the feeling of almost being crushed woke me up in a rude way. That was the worst thing I've ever been through. I've never felt anything worse. It began and went out at the same time. No amount of breathing or lying down would make the pain go away. A part of me would have been glad to die right there, but that didn't happen. When the tree started to move was the second most painful thing that ever happened to me. I couldn't for the life of me figure out why someone was taking care of it. Since that thing was almost as big as a mature evergreen. That kind of strength could only come from a monster. But my tent was still on top of me, but it was just in the right place, so that I wasn't being crushed to death, even though it was broken and I was still alive. I didn't know who or what was going on outside. I heard some loud grunts and labored breathing, but I didn't see anything until a big hairy hand pulled the tent off of me after the tree was cut down. I think my wounds hurt more because my blood pressure went up so quickly. I was lying there with some of my body broken, looking up into the eyes of what looked like a gorilla. From the way it looked at me, I could tell that it was smart. It looked at me like I was a test subject in a 4th grade classroom. It seemed to even know that I was hurt very badly. But it looked like it was sizing me up to see if I could be its next meal. I must have lost consciousness because I was so scared, and when I woke up the next time, I was in the hospital, which makes sense given what had happened. Doctors and nurses from the emergency room were checking on me regularly, and they told me I would be at a commission for a long time. I also lost both legs from the middle of the thigh down. I told them what I knew or thought I knew. They didn't say it directly, but I'm pretty sure they're just putting it all down to stress. Even though they had to have seen that a tree had fallen on my tent and was almost on top of me. I don't know if they know what happened or why it happened. There wasn't a storm or lightning, so saying that the tree just fell is silly. I think that something from the woods pushed the tree over on me and came to see how I was doing. I think it was aware of its presence. I believe it wanted to kill me. Why they didn't take me when I passed out, I have no idea. It was one of the most scary things I've ever seen in the woods. I want to say it's a Bigfoot, but I can't be sure. Now I think something does exist, though. My uncle called me while he was out hunting, and I could tell he had been drinking. He does hunt while drunk, but he hasn't killed anyone yet because he thought they were a bear or buck. I have no idea. His imagination gets the best of him when he drinks, and the fact that his eyes are going doesn't help. But that's not the point. He's an old man set in his ways, and unless he hurts someone, there's no way to take his guns away. So when I got the call, I knew it was time to go and make sure my uncle didn't accidentally shoot anyone who wasn't a threat. He went on and on about how he found a great free boulder, which scared me to death. My uncle sounded like he was about to fight a bear. But it was much bigger than I thought. I went to his property's woods and followed the trails to where he said I should go. When I got there, I saw him with a shotgun very close to something very big. It was sitting on a downed tree, leaning forward, with its back to us. I'm brave enough to go up to it. And I saw that it had a face that could have been mistaken for a human's if it weren't so hairy. And by human, I mean disgustingly ugly. For whatever reason, this thing looked dead, like it had just been left there. We looked for nicks, cuts, or bullet holes in the body or what I would assume to be a body. There wasn't any. But this thing smelled terrible. I immediately made up a speech in my head about how I was going to tell my uncle about what I had found. It was about all the reasons why we shouldn't have been there and why we should have left so we wouldn't be there when this thing or whoever killed it came to get it. I was walking back to my uncle when he raised his double-barreled shotgun, let out a whoop, and fired both barrels into the woods. My face is getting pale. We can hear sounds coming from the woods all around us. I can only say that the sound was like someone whooping, if that makes any sense. Then there were groans, moans, and grunts. I grabbed my uncle and we ran as fast as we could out of there. I don't know what was in the woods that day, but whatever it was, as many of them as there were must have been coming for their kill, which would have been the creature that lay in front of us, which was only a little bit bigger than a black bear. I have no idea what we ran into to this day. Part of me wants to think it's a Bigfoot, but why would a dead Bigfoot be in the middle of an opening? With more of them coming to get us. None of it makes sense. Still, one thing remains. The thought of going back to it scares me, and I try not to go back to my uncle's hunting property if I can help it. I had to get sick while I was on vacation and was trying to sleep. I should have been able to get more sleep, because I was in my cabin, which is in a pine forest on a hillside. I won't say where it is in case this story gets out and people try to find it for whatever reason. I really don't want vandals or people I don't know to come to my house. Thank you. Aside from that, this thundering sound woke me up just as I was falling asleep. It was so loud that the windows rattled, and I had just been rudely woken up and felt sick, so you can imagine I wasn't in the best mood as I threw on some clothes. I was going to go outside and tell whoever it was what I thought of them. I went outside, and it would have been a perfect summer evening if I hadn't been feeling sick. This horrible bellowing came from the top of the hill, above everything else. Whoever was making that noise must have had huge lungs, because it was scary to listen to. It sounded like a giant could have made it. Then I saw movement right in front of me going up the hill. After that, I saw enough to know that this wasn't a person. It was actually much bigger than any person. It had arms like tree limbs and a body like a tree trunk. This is why I'm going to lose a lot of friends. They're going to think I'm crazy. The thing looked just like every Bigfoot report I've ever heard in my whole life. The main difference is that I've never heard of a Bigfoot holding onto a tree and lifting his head up to the sky. My senses were heightened at the time, so I could pick up on every little thing. It even had a kind of beard coming out of its face, though it was salty and spicy. It was blowing in the wind in the evening. If this creature wasn't going to kill something, I don't know what it was doing other than yelling, which was its war cry. This scared me. I took a cue from every monster movie I've ever seen, and left instead of just standing there like an idiot. So I ran back inside and hid. I know this isn't the most exciting story you've ever heard, so you can do whatever you want with it. But I am sure I saw a Sasquatch up here in the woods. When I woke up one morning, my sheep were right outside my bedroom window. This meant that the fence was no longer up. I couldn't help but wonder what could have been out there that could have knocked down my fence. When I go outside, all of my sheep are scattered everywhere. I live in the country, so it's probably not a big deal, but when I checked the fence, it looked like a car had driven through it. The piece of fencing wasn't just knocked over, it was also mangled and torn out of the ground. That day, I spent a lot of money putting up the fence again, and even more nerves getting all my sheep together. I didn't spend as much time with them as I should have getting to know them and calling them. Instead, I tried to put the whole thing behind me and forget that I just spent about a month's worth of money. I went outside one afternoon, and the next morning, I saw the same thing. In fact, even more. Someone had taken down the fence. I wondered how this could have happened twice without waking me up. When it comes to a fence, that level of damage should be loud and clear. So I decided it was time to camp out and see what was going on. After paying to have it fixed for the second time, I knew I wouldn't be able to do it too many more times. When I finally got all my sheep back together, they hadn't gone too far. I set up a tent with my shotgun. My farmhouse, which was a good size, looked like a small dot from where I was. It was one of those moments when I realized how much land I really own. Being grateful was a better feeling for me at the time than being angry. It got dark quickly, but I had a pair of night vision goggles that helped me a lot. I wouldn't have woken up if I had fallen asleep. The person who came to see me was so quiet that you would have thought a ninja was putting on my goggles. I turned them on and looked, peeking my head out and stopping for a second, towering as tall as a small tree, but something that resembled a large ape lit up by my goggles. It was approaching the sheep pen. Very cautiously I saw the monster reach its arms out, grab hold of the fence, pull it out of the ground and snap it and rip it as if it were simply a fence built of toothpicks and string. This giant monster ape thought this must have been a joke. I watched him walk in the sheep, literally terrified and going crazy. It grabbed two smaller of my sheep, put them under its arms and casually walked off. I sat there with my mouth wide open, not even sure what I had to deal with or how I would deal with this problem. Well, turns out not long after that, before I really had a chance to deal with the issue, I ended up getting some severe health problems that I don't want to get into. Long story short, within a few months I lost my house, foreclosed, and now I don't live there anymore. Nor have I in quite some time. But after that night, that was it. I did not lose any more sheep and I got the fence fixed one last time. Fortunately for me, if the problem came back, it didn't seem to show itself, at least in its destructive nature. Hiking, camping and hunting are some of my very favorite things to do. I've had some pretty crazy experiences with animals not behaving like they're supposed to. I've been chased by creatures that are supposedly meant to be docile, and even had a mountain lion walked straight past me. But the story I tell over and over is the time that I saw what I truly believe to be a Sasquatch. I was down in Utah and trying out some ultimate survival skills in order to run a course back home. I feel confident that I'm tough and can deal with most things you might experience out in the wild and know the places to stay the hell away from. I might be a survivalist, but I'm not gonna intentionally put myself in the path of a mama bear or a hungry pack of wolves, even with my gun. So I don't go looking for trouble necessarily. I just teach how to survive if trouble finds you. And that day I truly believe if I hadn't had my wits about me, I would have been Sasquatch dinner for sure. I was nearing the end of the session down there anyway. When I took a deep hike, I had my gun holstered on my belt just in case there was, just waiting through the undergrowth when I'm hit by the most god-awful smell. It was terrible. I probably ain't no daisy myself, but this was terrible. Like 1,000 skunks had all set off their stink and then died. You get the picture. I'm thinking I'm about to come across some rotting corpses like a maggot-infested deer or something, but I can't spot anything on the ground. Then the trees start shaking and I could hear this noise. It was like a boom. There's either going to be an earthquake or something massive is coming through the trees. Then I see it. It doesn't come too close, leaving itself some room, but it is massive and partially hidden by the trees. But I could see this huge mass of what looked to be a body very resembling have a bear or a gorilla. Then something hit me. I look down and it's a small rock. The more hit me and I see this huge creature is pummeling me with rocks in my direction, and that was when I made the connection. Disgusting, smells, huge footsteps and a large body. Now the stones being thrown at me. I've only ever heard of these kinds of things through tales. There's no doubting this was indeed a Bigfoot. Could I have possibly stumbled across its territory or gotten too close to its home? Unfortunately, I didn't get the chance to investigate further. As it started throwing bigger and bigger rocks, and one nearly caught me in the face. I thought I'd get the hell out of there before it killed me. Interestingly enough, this being, whatever it was assuming it was, a Bigfoot, could have easily killed me while throwing rocks at me, but it wasn't. It was intentionally missing me, throwing small rocks as if trying to get my attention to beat it. I truly wonder if it really wanted me out of there, and maybe it smelt me first, which is why it was drawn to me. One thing I know for sure now, is that Bigfoots are real. When I was just a kid, we had a couple of cousins that lived way out in the countryside. They were full-on proper hillbillies, and that was for sure. But with hearts of gold, and I loved visiting them. We'd play for hours out in the woods back then, and we were actually allowed to be out all day or until our bellies rumbled for food. The woods were likely full of all sorts of dangerous stuff, but they were the kind of people that you thought you had to learn from your own mistakes and to not coddle the kids. It was great tree climbing, den building, swinging across the river. We'd come home covered in filth and bruises, and my aunt would always just say, "Did you guys have fun?" We'd always tell him we did. So, the day we came running back to the house after having been only out for a couple of hours, tears streaking down our faces and more than down my youngest cousin's leg, they knew something must have happened. We told them that we were playing far in the woods, down by the old creek and the tire swing, and all of a sudden we smelled this terrible smell, and the first thing we did was blame each other, but it was 100 times worse than even a fart could be. A rustling noise and brush. We turned and we saw it. Some sort of half man, half gorilla watching us. It made us scream. This thing was huge, and it was looking at us high up in the trees. Its face was kind of like a monkey. It was really tall and covered in dark reddish hair. It opened its mouth and roared. And we all saw just how massive its teeth were. We ran. We were then told by my uncle, he and my older cousin Dale had grabbed their guns and headed back to that exact spot. When they came back, they hadn't found a thing, but the smell, that god-awful stench lingered, and there was also some footprints as what appeared. I swear my uncle looked like he'd actually seen a ghost pale. He said the footprints were huge, much larger than any of their shoe size. And my uncle is practically a size 1314. He told us boys that we weren't allowed to go back ever. In his opinion, we had seen ourselves a Squatch. This story takes place when my grandfather was still very much alive. He was the kind of man that spent literally every waking hour of his life working as a rancher, squeezing every dime out of every last second of his time. It paid off. He was able to retire quite handsomely, and get a comfortable house in the middle of 17 acres of forest. If that doesn't sound isolated? Well, it was. He never did like people, and I was kind of lucky that he liked me. He was every bit of the old man's stereotype that shakes his fist and tells people to go away more often than not when he wanted to spend time with me. I ended up being his bouncer. Any stray sounds in the woods surrounding his home was an intruder, and I had to be the one to go on and tell them to get off. It always ended up being a squirrel or a falling branch or some other ridiculous, benign non-human cause. He was kind of psychotic. So I guess you could assume that by this point, but that didn't dissuade him one bit. If he heard it, he had to attack it. His successful retirement hadn't upgraded his diet by much. He still had me over for some stew right out of the can. And when we were eating, we had heard a sound that was on the level of thunder, only it wasn't coming from the sky. It couldn't have been, the sky is being perfectly clear. I can vividly remember his face getting red and telling me to go chase the kids off his land. I believe that there was something to this time, because whatever that sound was, it was deafening. I was pretty apprehensive in going out to take care of this problem. All I had was a revolver that he had gifted me when I was 16. It was better than nothing. But still, I entered a clearing in the woods where I found the source of the clamor. I could scarcely believe my eyes, and it was kind of a miracle that I didn't mess myself on the spot. Nothing in all my years could have prepped me for what I saw. Ever heard of a Bigfoot? I mean, who hasn't by now? But have you ever heard of a snowy white albino Bigfoot? Maybe that's a little new, at least for me. Heard of a snowy white Bigfoot having a violent encounter with other wildlife? It may sound like a story, but that's what I was trying to say. As you might expect, this thing was huge, and a group of timber wolves had decided to fight. And this big white Bigfoot, if that's what it was, grabbed one wolf and tore it in half like it was nothing. The other one was grabbed and almost died from being choked. It was really scary. I was shocked, but they didn't stop and kept coming at us. Then it grabbed a third wolf by its legs and slammed it against a tree, as if it were a dead rabbit. I ran because I was afraid for my own life and safety. Then I had to tell my grandfather that I saw something, a Bigfoot, hurting several timber wolves. He did about what you'd expect him to do. His eyes got big, and he waited for me to tell him more, but he might not have believed me right then. Likewise. A few years later, he called me to say that he had seen a Bigfoot, a white one that I had told him about. I know there are scarier things than a Bigfoot, but the whole experience and the way it made me feel small. If some things on Earth think that wolves are nothing more than field mice, what are men? I guess I shouldn't be so surprised by how things look from this new angle. But I've spent my whole life seeing men in a place in the universe where they don't really belong. It has really made me feel something. It has changed me in a bad way. This is the best choice. It was one of the scariest things I've ever seen, and it shows me that humans are no longer at the top of the food chain. My best friend when I was growing up was a border collie we named Cindy. Cindy was just as wild as you'd expect a dog of her breed to be. And if you are familiar with border collies, so, it shouldn't come as a shock. She was just like any other person. She treated me like a sheepdog, even though we didn't have any sheep. Sheepdogs are great at herding sheep, but we didn't have any. I was her animals that she had to keep in line. So it was kind of a game between her and me to see how far I could get before her instincts took over and she had to come get me or whatever she was doing in her head at the time. At the time, we lived on the edge of a large pine forest in Nebraska. Even though there was plenty of wood for us to explore, my parents did not want me to go into the woods by myself. I mean, I was only 7 years old at the time, but as any parent of a 7-year-old knows, children only exist to test the limits that are put in front of them. To the dismay of creatures like parents and even sheepdogs. If you're hearing this story on a certain cryptid encounter podcast, then you know I have a story for you that doesn't end well. It was one of those trips that shouldn't have happened. My parents weren't there, but their friends and Cindy were. Plus, they told me very sternly not to run off into the woods. So, with so many eyes watching, I shouldn't have been able to get away without being caught. Somehow? It did, and as soon as I saw a chance, I took off to see how far I could get before Cindy came looking for me. I had already forgotten about the adults for a long time. I got a pretty good start, but then I started to get lost, and neither an adult nor a dog came to look for me. I got lost, and at the time I couldn't find my way back. So I went into a very small clearing where there was a small pond. I was so enchanted that I forgot to think about going home. Something moved in the trees' shadows. And that's when I ran into the biggest living thing I had ever seen or known. It looked like a monkey, but I guess it also looked a lot like a man. If this makes sense, I used to call it a mountain monkey. I didn't know if I should be scared or interested. The thing's face was a mix of interest and confusion, but I could tell it wasn't friendly, just like when it was reaching out. Cindy showed up out of nowhere, put herself between me and this huge monkey thing, and started barking like crazy. Her hair stood up, and her teeth showed. This made the creature or monster, whatever it was, even more curious. The creature just reached out with its hand and tried to grab Cindy. That's when I was really scared, because it grabbed Cindy and choked her to death. When I say choked, I don't mean in the usual way. It literally grabbed Cindy and crushed her like she was a Coke can. That's when I panicked and ran away crying and screaming. I ran into my father, who was very angry. After everything settled down, he didn't know if he should be glad to see me or angry. The question of where Cindy was brought up naturally. At age 7, I tried to explain as best I could with my very limited vocabulary that this giant monkey man killed her, but they didn't get what I meant for a very long time. Many people say that when they've seen Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever, it's been hard to shoot it because it looks too human. I think that if I ever saw it again and was armed, I would have no problem getting even and shooting it right in the eyes. It sounded like my dog was fighting for its life while it was being crushed. Alive is now this clear, scary memory in my head, and my parents will always be. But at the time, they thought I saw a bear kill Cindy. They were wrong. In the fall of 1990, a group of my friends and I drove to Livermore, California, down our rodeo road. It was probably spring or summer, because I don't remember it being cold at the end of our rodeo at the time, or off a turn-off was a pumping station for the local reservoir, where we parked in the street. The reason for this trip was a path to the ruins of a former mental hospital. It wasn't clear if there was a more direct route, but Arroyo Road was empty and rarely used at that time. We thought it would be fun, and we had tried to go on this trip before, but we never made it. After dark, I was driving one of the two cars. The other driver and I got out of our cars and turned towards the hillside behind us. I was shining a flashlight up the hill when I saw a tall, furry brown creature walking on two legs from left to right for about 30 to 40 feet. This was about 40 feet away, and the other driver was right next to me, so I asked, "Do you see what I'm seeing?" He eagerly replied, I couldn't finish the sentence before. "Yes, I am." I kept shining the light on the thing as it moved to the right and then started going up the hill. As the others got out of the car, it disappeared. The other driver and I talked quickly about how we shouldn't tell the others about this because it would only scare them. We got out all the flashlights and followed the cars up the hill. I had been to the same place 3 or 4 times before and had never been scared. Like I was that same night, I didn't turn off the light in front of us. Instead, I kept shining it behind and around us, looking for the same thing I saw, which I'm still sure was a Bigfoot. So was the other driver we shared with the rest of the group, who told us we had seen a bear or something else. Well, I'm here to tell you that it wasn't a bear. It was tall, dark brown, and walked easily on 2 legs. Even though there were about 10 of us, only the other driver and I saw this creature. On that night, neither of us had anything to eat or drink. About 10 years later, I did some research on the internet and remember reading that there had been other sightings in the Liverpool area before. I tried to find those details again, but I wasn't able to. This happened in Virginia's James City County, on October 22, 2020, after dinner in Williamsburg with my 2 boys and ex-husband. We were driving back to our hotel. I turned left onto East Rochambeau Drive, which runs parallel to Interstate 64. At the time, it was about 9 p.m. on a clear, dark night. I know for sure it was after 8:50 p.m. and right before 9, I wanted to get back so I could watch the 9 o'clock news. Debate. My son said something about how fast I was going, so I showed him a sign that said the speed limit was 55 miles per hour. As we passed it, I turned a corner and saw a small flash of light that made me think I saw something move. I could tell right away that it was standing up, that it had 2 legs. As it moved quickly from right to left, I could see right away that it walked like a person, but it was very wide and very big. I could see muscles in the arms and upper thighs because they were so big. The figure was even darker than black and looked almost like a huge shadow, but it was much more solid. My lights only showed more black, no clothes, and just one solid, whole person. As it walked, I could see the middle of its face and most of its legs, but I couldn't see any of its other features. It went very fast and easily. I can't see where its feet are or where its head is. In fact, it happened so quickly that I didn't even have time to tell my family to look. As soon as it walked up next to me, I asked, "What is that?" I was wondering where it went, and as I walked by, I could see that it went into the woods. It is important to know there were no cars, people, or anything else on the road. A little further down the road, there was a small house with a front porch light that was on. I keep trying to figure out how far my car was from where it walked in the woods and how tall it was, but what I saw was huge. No human being could ever be that tall or wide again. It was so dark that even with my lights on, I couldn't see anything. My kids were scared to death, so I did not stop. Since then, I've gone back to the area twice to look at that road, and the area around it. It's important to remember that the road was dark and the figure was black, so black, in fact, that I could easily see this shape walking, even though a quick flash of light caught my eye and made this huge figure clear. It didn't look in our direction. I'm still looking to see if there are any more stories. I've been back to this spot twice to look at the land distance and try to figure out how high it was, where it came from, and why it might have been traveling in that area. In February 2011, I was driving between Potlatch, Idaho, and Tenst, Idaho, on Highway 95 between midnight and 2 a.m. On the right side of the highway, there was a wooded pasture. On the left, which is also the driver's side of the highway, there was an open grass pasture and a creek. I was driving around a curve before Wigan Private Road when I saw a large, dark form walk straight across the highway from right to left, about 50 feet in front of me. At the time, I thought it was a person, so I came to a complete stop in the middle of the highway, which was empty in both directions. Except for me. At this point, I realized I couldn't see this person on the side of the road or in the grassy field to my left. Yes, my high beams were on, and the area was very well lit because of that. Then I got a terrible feeling of dread, so I hit the gas and drove home, which was only 5 or 6 miles away. At that point, I was so upset by what had happened that I kept looking in my rearview mirror, expecting to see something bad or to have something bad happen to me. I ran into my house as soon as I got home, turned on all the lights, and woke up my whole family. Everyone else just kind of laughed it off, but my dog climbed up on my lap, whimpered at me, and wouldn't leave my side. That night, I didn't sleep at all, and I even tried to avoid driving on that highway so late. I didn't really start to understand what had happened until much later. I realized that I had seen a 2-legged person walk across the highway. That was a fact I couldn't miss. I can still remember how the legs moved like they were walking and how the arms made a small swinging motion. I also saw that the figure was completely black while I had my high beams on it. It was strange that clothes, shoes, and even shadows didn't cast anything on the road. The other thing that really bothered me was that I never took my eyes off of what was going on, but the figure disappeared somewhere between walking across the road and walking off the side. I definitely should have been able to see something walk down the side of the ditch or into the pasture, but it was empty. It took me a long time to come to terms with what happened, and it took me even longer to admit that it might have been a Sasquatch sighting. In fact, I felt compelled to report this sighting because a woman recently claimed to have seen a Sasquatch right before she hit a deer in almost the same area at about the same time, but the local news made fun of her. Go figure. I don't know if she really did see one, but the fact that it happened in the same spot on the highway and at the same time is a very, very strange coincidence. There might be something there. But there are other stories. People in the area must talk a lot behind closed doors about seeing Sasquatches, but they rarely say so in public. It doesn't shock me. In fact, in March, a woman said she hit a deer and then saw a Sasquatch in the same place where I saw one years earlier. A woman who is very different from the one I just talked about. There is more going on here than you might think. When this sighting happened, I was 17, and the year was 1981. That was a very different time than now. No cell phones, no devices you can hold in front of your face, and nothing but forced human contact. A better time overall. But when I was 17 and exploring in the backwoods, probably looking for arrowheads or anything else that would interest a 17-year-old boy, I saw something in the woods that I couldn't explain, and would only call a Bigfoot. I think I was just looking for something to do so I wouldn't have to go back home to my alcoholic and abusive father. Do anything to keep me from going home. At the time, the woods were my safe place. When this happened, it made me feel even worse about being at home or being forced to go somewhere else. If I remember right, I was messing around with a stick, probably trying to carve a spear, when I looked up and saw a strange face looking at me from the tree line. I wasn't sure what it was at first, but when it moved, it looked like it was watching me with interest. Then I realized it wasn't a person, but something else. Some strange animal that can be named. Then I realized that this animal had the build of a linebacker and was probably 89 feet tall and covered in thick, woolly brown hair. It had a big nose like ours, a strong brow line, and thin lips, so it looked a lot like a person. The eyes were dark, and I couldn't tell what they looked like, but the thing looked at me and watched me. I was both curious and scared, but something deep inside me told me this was dangerous. Then, as it kept staring at me, I started to feel like I was in trouble. I had that fight or flight feeling that tells you you are in very serious danger. Then I heard rustling all around me, and I knew I wasn't alone. At that moment, I knew I was surrounded. Then, when I turned around to look at this creature again, it was gone, and I heard more rustling all around me. There were many of these things, and they were getting closer and closer to me. I ran out of there like a bat out of hell, and for the rest of that day, week, or even months, I had to deal with my abusive, drunken father. They didn't go back to that same spot in the woods because they were afraid of whatever it was. 10 years later, around 1991, and some friends who had just met me at the time told me that my story was about a Bigfoot. Nothing will make you lose your job as a park ranger faster than not responding to a fire in the right way. Most of the time, they don't care if you get caught in it or not. If your bosses are in a bad enough mood, the fact that there was a fire and you were nearby could be enough to get you fired. After all, it was the dry season at the park where I work. We were warned almost every day about how perfect the conditions were for a huge fire. We were all on edge at the time, but I was the most so. I was having nightmares about the whole place catching on fire and then everyone blaming me for it. When I saw real fires that were being put out and cared for the right way, my heart almost started to race. I went from place to place. One afternoon, when the park was almost empty, they went there. So I pulled up to a place that looked like it was made for a grill. There was a fire in the pit, and it went way past the circle of stones. No one was there. When I felt that rush of adrenaline, it was scary. I jumped out of the police car and ran over to see what I could do to stop the fire, which hadn't gotten out of control yet. When I got to the stone circle and stood over it, the fire was gone. This only scared me for a split second. I then looked around and saw that the fire had moved from the fire pit to the prairie grass where the picnic site was made. I began panicking. I may or may not have had a little poop at the same time. I ran around in circles for about 30 seconds before making a mad dash toward the flames to try to put them out. When I got there, the flames were gone. They were farther away at the edge of the forest that bordered the prairie grass. I checked myself to make sure I wasn't having a stroke or a heart attack. I looked around the area where I was standing. There were no signs of fire, like burned grass, ashes, the smell of smoke, or anything else. From where I was standing, I looked at the fire for a moment, and it looked just like a real fire. The smoke was visible. I could even hear the fire crackling. The strangeness of the situation made me feel less scared, so I walked toward the flames and kept my eyes on them. When I was about 15 steps away, they went away. When I got to the place, I could see the fire in the forest a long way away. I then had a feeling of paranoia that was hard to describe. I didn't dare turn around, so I followed it wherever the fire went out and came back. It pointed me in one direction, in a straight line. I found what was left of a campsite that had been set up to stay out of sight. It was behind a lot of thick, dense bushes with sharp thorns and was hidden by tall brush. I wanted to turn around because it was hard to get through, but I had already come this far. I couldn't go back anymore, so I started looking around the campsite and found things that were scarier than the phantom fire. I saw a blue tarp that had been buried that was full of surgical tools. When I looked more closely, I could see that they were stained with old blood. This surprised me. I knew there was something else nearby I didn't want to find, but I did find 2 bodies wrapped in a different tarp and buried in a shallow grave. Because the bodies were partly burned, it was hard to tell who or what they were. I think whoever tried to burn them to get rid of them found that it wasn't as easy as they thought it would be. After the police showed up, they tried to quickly wrap them up and bury them. With the help of forensics, they found that a boy had been taken from an hour away and a girl had been taken from about 3 hours away. The fact that the 2 people killed didn't know each other makes the whole thing even more sickening. I used to be a ranger, so I just wanted to give you $2. I don't know what happened because something was found afterward. Let me explain. I was taking a break in my park near one of the pavilions to get a cup of coffee. I jumped when an older woman tapped on the glass of my driver's side door after I rolled it down, and asked if there was anything I could do to help. At the time, I thought I was all alone. She just looked at me with a blank face and asked if she was okay. I started to open my door so I could help her, but she fell down right where she was. I panicked and started CPR when I saw that the middle of her shirt had been torn off. All that was left of her was a hole in her chest where her heart had been taken out. I told everything over the radio, and people came to take care of the body and find out what happened. That one was a big investigation, but I haven't heard a thing about it since. I've been told to keep quiet about it, and no one in my field or higher-ups talks about it. It doesn't even make sense. And I know it's a strange and weird thing to happen. I don't even know how to explain it, but it seems like in this line of work, we run into a lot of things that just don't make sense. I don't know if you know about all the strange and weird things that happen in the Forest Service business. It's not the most exciting job in the world, and there are many boring parts of the day, but there are times when you get so cold you can't move. In my early 20s, when I was an intern for the first few years, we had a very interesting situation. Before I go on, I want to say that I have pretty strong beliefs. That is, I don't really believe in things like Bigfoot, fairies, or monsters under the bed. I don't believe in any of that, but my job has made me think about things I shouldn't normally think about. I had been in my job for about 7 months when we got a call from some campers who were upset and crying. They said that a giant ape had broken into their camp and taken one of their friends. We got there and tried to calm them down, but they were crying so hard that we couldn't help. Well, the police got involved, and it turned into a full-fledged investigation. We, including me, were part of a full-fledged search and rescue for the missing persons, who turned out to be a young girl in her late teens whom they said a large gorilla had taken. When they said that, my first thought was Bigfoot, but I don't really believe in that. So I just assumed that they had been drinking too much the night before and that she got lost when she wandered off. But after spending some time with the campers, I found that they were pretty clean and sober. There were no drugs or alcohol, just a couple of good kids my age having fun and partying in the woods. When I say partying, I don't mean drugs and alcohol, I mean a double date. They were just hiking and being alone in nature to enjoy their time together. Their story was that they were camping quietly when, in the middle of the night, a big gorilla came to their tent and started thrashing around. When they went to see what was going on, the gorilla was gone. This thing grabbed the youngest girl in the group, dragged her away, and ran off. I'm not sure what that looks like right now. This is just what they told us, the rangers, again about what went on. Remember that their body language shows that they are scared to death. We could see everything. They were terrified to the point of no return. If they were making this up, they couldn't have been the best actors and actresses in the world. So, like I said, the police came, took statements, got very involved, and a search and rescue team started working for a few days. Well, We couldn't find any sign of the missing girl, and our dogs couldn't even pick up a scent trail. However, we did find a piece of her torn clothing about 4 miles away from where they were camping, in the opposite direction of the park, deeper in the woods, and where there aren't any trails. It was a piece of her worn-out clothing that was linked to her through DNA. We don't have any other solid proof besides that. So I'm not sure if my idea that she got drunk and lost her way is still true at this point. Once I found out that, we stopped looking for her. I don't remember exactly when we stopped, but she was marked as missing, and to be honest, she was never found. That case is still very clear in my mind. I still wonder what happened to her and where she went, if she went anywhere, or if this strange gorilla creature really did come and take her. They said that they had seen that scare and run through their camp. Even though the story itself is very disturbing, this case is just one of many that people in the Forest Service have to deal with more than we'd like. I've been wanting to write to you and tell you my story for a while now. The one that stands out to me most is a very scary thing that happened to me when I was a ranger many, many years ago. I'd say it happened about 7 or 8 years ago. Now we're back to around the summer of 2013. I won't tell you the state or the park. I'd rather not tell anyone. After all, I don't want my name to be linked to this in any way. You never know with the internet, but I can say it's in the Midwest of the United States, closer to the Great Lakes, but that's all I'll say. There was talk at the time that some of my co-workers had found nooses all over the park. Not just one, and luckily they were all empty, but they all seemed to be made of the same rope tied in the same way, and it looked like someone had made a lot of them and hung them up all over the park. I thought the whole thing was strange, but soon after that, they were taken down. Then a few more months went by, and it was very late summer, late August or early September, when I first heard people talking about it. I thought my colleagues were just joking, you know, pulling my leg thinking that whole thing again, even though I did believe them back in the spring when they were seeing it. But the sudden reappearance of these nooses was very, very scary. Until I found them on my own. I found about 7 of them all in different areas of the parks and the most disturbing places that people can't even get to easily. Places that are miles away from the trail. Just weird stuff. When we put many of the nooses next to each other, they were all made of the same kind of rope, tied in the same way, and were even the same length. Nobody, and I say this again and again, no one was hanging from them. All of these nooses were empty, so why were they put up on random tree branches all over the park, where no one was going? It didn't make much sense. And even still thinking back about all of this, it still makes me wonder who set those up and why.